Hi everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar by DLP and Edge Analytics. My mic was muted, so I was saying hi to everyone. It's great to see you all. We're about 40 people, 41 people on the call. We might have nearly 50 people in total. So welcome to this webinar. And Kate Staines, Senior Consultant from Edge Analytics, is here, and Kirsten Ward, Director in our Research and Analysis team at DLP. Hi, Iona. Is it something technical that you need to clarify with us? Let me just get the chat open. No, okay. I'll make a start. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's been nearly a year to the day since the government published its consultation on the standard method. I think at the time there was a mix of fear, enthusiasm, dread, maybe even excitement about what the numbers may mean for local plans, may mean for house building, and may mean for decision making. A lot has gone under the bridge since then, and a lot of dust has settled. Today we're looking at planning for housing to meet our future needs. So we'll be covering the standard method. I know for my point of view, I understand the numbers and what they may mean for different local authorities, but I don't necessarily understand the nuts and bolts, the substance behind the standard method and the numbers. How has the government reached these particular figures, and how are they changing going into the future as well? So that's what we're going to be covering today. I'm really looking forward to learning something new from Kate and from Kirsten. Before I hand over to them both, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded and it will be circulated to all attendees afterwards, and then posted on DLP's YouTube channel. Please enter questions into the Q&A function as we go through. And then after presentations, we'll then go through the Q&A and the different questions that we've got. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kirsten and Kate, who will take us through the presentation and introduce themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. So firstly, just to run through what we're going to be covering off today in a bit more detail. Firstly, Kate and I will briefly introduce ourselves and the companies that we work for and the work that we do. Then I'll go on to discuss the standard method and the implications of the most recent changes to the MPPF and the standard method calculation. Then I'll hand over to Kate, who will talk through the approach to demographic projections and calculating housing needs. And then I'll briefly discuss an example of how we use demographic projections to calculate housing needs for older people. And then we'll draw together some key conclusions from what we've discussed. And finally, as Matt said, there'll be an opportunity for us to respond to your questions at the end. So if you want to add those to the Q&A box as we go through, feel free to do so. So firstly, who we are. So I work for DLP, as Matt says. I'm a director in our research and analysis team based in our Sheffield office. DLP is an independent planning-led consultancy. We currently operate from 7 offices across England. The specialist research and analysis team within which I work provides an independent advice and evidence to support applications, plan making, and infrastructure delivery across both the public and private sectors. So in terms of our public sector work, this includes undertaking housing needs and land availability assessments, on which we work very closely with Kate and Edge Analytics. We also undertake other studies such as employment needs assessments, infrastructure delivery plans, and support with local plan preparation more broadly. Kate, would you like to introduce Edge and the work that you do?
Hi everybody, I'm Kate Staines. I'm a senior consultant at Edge Analytics. We're based at Nexus at the University of Leeds. We are demographic modelling, forecasting and optimisation specialists, and we produce robust demographic intelligence and insights to support planning and investment. We work on behalf of local authorities, also in school place planning and on behalf of utility companies, and we've worked with DLP closely in the last few years on housing needs assessments. Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks, Kate. So in terms of the standard method for calculating housing need, this provides a baseline for determining the number of new homes needed in a local area. The housing need itself is an unconstrained policy-off assessment. So assessing housing need should, in theory, be undertaken separately from assessing housing land availability, establishing a housing requirement figure, and preparing policies to address this, such as site allocations. On the other hand, a housing requirement is a policy-on figure, which takes into account local constraints and strategies for delivery to determine whether or not the housing need figure can be met in full. The standard method was originally introduced in 2018, as a lot of you will probably know, and this was as part of an update to the MPPF, or the National Planning Policy Framework. It used a formula which was based on household projections and affordability adjustments to determine the minimum number of homes that are expected to be planned for in a local authority area. The initial step involved using the 2014 based household projections to estimate the number of new homes needed over a 10-year period. Baseline figure was then adjusted upwards based on local affordability factors. This adjustment was typically triggered in areas where house prices are significantly higher than local earnings, and that's based on the ONS house price to workplace-based earnings ratio, which is published on an annual basis. Standard method also at that time included a cap to ensure that the local housing need was not significantly higher than existing plan requirements, and therefore more likely to be achievable in the short to medium term. This calculation was then revised in 2020 to include an urban uplift, and that was applied to the 20 largest towns and cities. This uplift of 35% was fairly arbitrary and didn't really take into account any local constraints. The new standard method was then introduced in December 2024. The step one of this is the calculation of the baseline need. This is calculated based on 0.8% of the existing housing stock in the local authority, and this replaced the previous step one that relied on fairly outdated household projections. The government guidance on housing and economic needs assessments, this explains that the housing stock provides a better baseline than household projections because it's more stable and predictable, and it also ensures that all areas as a minimum are contributing a share of the national total that's proportionate to the size of their current housing market. However, this is no longer a demographically derived figure, which begs the question, who is going to live in these homes and where will those people come from? This also means that the overall housing need figure is fairly disconnected from analysis of other elements of housing needs, such as affordable housing or housing mix requirements, which are based on demographic projections, as Kate will come on to discuss shortly. An affordability adjustment is also applied. Unlike the previous standard method, which just used the previous year's median affordability ratio, this is now calculated taking the average of the median affordability ratio for the local authority over the previous 5 years. An uplift, skipped too soon there. An uplift is applied everywhere where the average affordability ratio is over 5, and for each 1% the ratio is above 5, the housing stock baseline is increased by 0.95%. So, for example, in an authority with a ratio of 10, it will have a 95% increase on its annual housing stock baseline. The affordability adjustment is applied to take account of past under delivery, and the standard method identifies the minimum uplift that will be required. And so there's therefore no longer a requirement to specifically address under delivery separately. You'll note as well that the 35% uplift for urban areas has now been removed, as has the cap. So in terms of the implications of the new standard method for local plan making, government's objective is to deliver 350,000 new homes per year, which is an increase from the 300,000 per year target under the previous Conservative government. Under the current standard method, as of May 2025, across all authorities, the total value of the calculation would in theory deliver around 371,000 dwellings per year were these needs to be met in full. The standard method outputs change twice per year, once when the new median affordability ratios are published, which is usually in March, and once when the new dwelling stock estimates are published, which is usually in May. So since the new standard method was published in December 2024, the outcomes have changed twice. Between December 2024 and May 2025, the average standard method figure for England has changed by just 1.8 dwellings per year. At a regional level, as shown on this graph, there were marginal average increases across all areas, with the exception of London, which saw an average decrease of 53 dwellings per year. This table shows the largest increases and decreases in the standard method outcomes between December 2024 and the current figures as of May 2025 at a local authority level. Some of these authorities, such as Leeds, are currently preparing new plans, so these revised figures will need to be taken into account. The largest increases in the standard method outcomes between 2024 and 2025 were in the north and northwest of England, particularly in Manchester and the surrounding authorities. The largest decreases in the standard method outputs were in the London authorities, and that's primarily due to the fall in affordability ratios. So as you can see in this table, Kensington and Chelsea saw the steepest decline in calculated need, driven by a notable fall in affordability ratio, which fell from 34.3 to 22.8 between 2023 and 2024. Standard method is a mandatory calculation for housing need, except where strategic policy-making authorities do not align with local authority boundaries or where data is not available at that scale, for example, in national parks. The standard method figure, according to PPG, should be reviewed and revised up to the point of submission, following which it's valid for 2 years. So whilst the numbers are unlikely to change significantly in a particular authority, this should be taken into consideration in plan preparation. Circumstances where the housing requirement might exceed the standard method should also be considered, including meeting the needs of neighbouring areas or supporting economic growth aspirations or infrastructure investment. Paragraph 69 of the MPPF continues to support ambitious authorities in planning for growth and support circumstances where the housing requirement may be higher than the identified housing need. However, this does need to be supported by robust evidence and justified at examination. So where strategic policies are being produced jointly, or where spatial development strategies are being prepared by elected mayors or combined authorities, according to PPG, the housing need for the defined area should be at least the sum of the local housing need for each planning authority in the area. And then it will be for the relevant strategic plan making authority to distribute that local total housing requirement, which is then arrived at across the plan area. Paragraph 61 of the MPPF also states that the overall aim should be to meet an area's identified housing need. Strategic policy-making authorities should establish a housing requirement figure for their whole area, which shows the extent to which their identified housing need, plus any needs that cannot be met in neighbouring authority areas, can be met over the plan period. I'll now pass over to Kate, who will discuss their approach to demographic projections and the use in housing needs. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yes, so as Kirsten has outlined, the standard method provides us with a local housing need figure for each planning authority in England. And obviously previously, with the standard method being based on household projections, we had a sort of demographic starting point for our assessment of need. But with this calculation now disconnected from the demographics, how can we get the information that is required to inform the detailed assessment of housing need? So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the importance of demographics in housing needs assessments, the latest official population and household projections, and the approach that we take at Edge with DLP in linking the standard method figures to projections of population and households. So it would be impossible to determine the future housing needs of a population without understanding the size, the structure of the current population, the factors that have driven growth historically, and how these are likely to change over time. We kind of effectively have a one-size-fits-all housing need methodology with the standard method, albeit with the affordability adjustments for each area. But obviously each area has a unique combination of factors driving and influencing demographic change. The UK population is ageing. Since 1991, the proportion of England's population aged over 65 has increased from 15.8% to 18.7% as those larger post-war birth cohorts age. And at the same time, fertility rates have also reached historic lows. And in recent years, we've seen unprecedented levels of net international overseas migration. And in many areas, these changes pose a real challenge to planners of local services, housing, education. So population change driven by the balance between births and deaths and the flow of migrants to or from an area. But there are obviously many factors that can influence this, such as the existing age structure of the population. Is it more heavily weighted towards the older age groups, or has it got a more youthful profile? External factors such as housing availability, affordability, employment opportunities, access to things like healthcare and education. These all influence where and when people move to and from areas. And crucially, for our assessment of housing needs, the population that is formed in these areas and the households that form. So understanding how that population is likely to change is vital when assessing housing needs. This slide is just summarising the key demographic inputs to a housing needs assessment, and these items on the left, they're used across multiple sections of the analysis, including affordable needs and the needs of specific groups. That includes students, people with disabilities, families with children, key workers, older persons, and private rented sector. And the household projections by age and type are also a key input to housing mix assessment that provides us with evidence on the potential size, type and tenure of homes that are needed in the future. And then in assessments that also consider the economic growth needs of an area, statistics on the labour force are also required, as well as things like commuting data, unemployment evidence and forecasts of economic growth. So the importance of the demographics in assessing housing needs is highlighted in PPG, and I've just pulled out a couple of quotes here. References made to identifying the number of households and the levels of new household formation over the course of a plan period, along with the importance of the age profile of the population, and the sort of suggested data sources that people can use in the assessments, things like the census and household and population projections. Within the needs of other groups, those ones I've just outlined, references in fact still made in the guidance to the household projections underpinning the standard method, which, as Kirsten's gone over, this is no longer the case. So with no demographic element to the standard method and somewhat kind of limited guidance, where do we start with estimating population and household growth for a given area? Within the housing needs assessment, the analysis required involves normally assessing the current and future housing needs. So for information on the current characteristics of a population, the census, the 21 census recently carried out, has provided us with a wealth of information on local area demographics. We've got information on updated age profiles, patterns of household occupancy, labour force participation, the communal population, so population not in households. This includes older people in care homes and students in halls of residence. but it is a fixed point in time, the census. So between each census, population estimation is necessary. The Office for National Statistics, the ONS, produces annual population estimates by rolling on the previous year's estimate, taking account of births and deaths, and estimates of internal and international migration. Importantly, following a census, the intercensal mid-year estimates, so in this case between 2011 and 2021, they're reviewed by ONS and adjusted or rebased to ensure that there is sufficient alignment between those two census estimates. Births and deaths typically subject to only minor revisions in this rebasing and reconciliation process because these are recorded statistics, although the COVID pandemic did affect some registrations for births and deaths, so there were delays with those. So those figures have been adjusted in some areas. And then the degree to which migration flows have been adjusted really depends on the area. Some areas have seen much larger adjustments to their migration flows over the historical time period than others. And then with this release of the rebased mid-year estimate data and the census data, we've got an updated historical time series from which to draw insights on population change and, importantly, assumptions that can inform future projections. The charts here are just illustrating that comparison between the pre-census mid-year estimates in the red dashed line and then the blue, the current rebased mid-year estimates, also including the latest couple of years of population evidence. The notable uptick in the recent years, largely driven by net international migration. So to evaluate how the population might change in the future, we can look to the official population and household projections that are produced by ONS. These are underpinned by those historical mid-year estimates that I've mentioned. The subnational population projections, that is projections for local authority districts, provide us with there's a number of variant scenarios of population growth, and these are linked to the national projections, which is illustrated in this chart here, the range of variants that are produced by ONS. And then the household projections are informed by these subnational projections and assumptions relating to household occupancy. May be aware the 2022 based SNPP, the subnational population projection, was released in June this year, and that's due to be followed by the associated household projections in the autumn, which are long overdue. We're still waiting for those, and the date's still provisional at the minute, but they're a really important update to our understanding of potential future changes to household occupancy. So a range of population variants has been produced in that 2022 release, and the ONS has for the first time recommended that their migration category scenario is treated as its principal projection, and this is due to the kind of recent changes to migration, and that this scenario is better aligning with the latest estimates. And I've just picked out two regions here. You can see for Yorkshire, Humber and London that this migration category, that dark line on the charts, is a more moderate projection compared to the 5-year trend, which aligns with what we know that's happened in the last 5 years. Significant increase in net international migration. But in London, interestingly, the scenario is lower than the 5-year or 10-year migration variance. The SNPP, they are projections, they're not forecasts. ONS is very clear on this. They're based on a continuation of recent demographic trends, and assumptions are drawn from a 5-year history preceding that 2022 base year. It's worth noting at the end of this month, the ONS is planning on releasing its 2024 mid-year estimate, so the population estimate for 2024, and importantly, they're also revising the 2022 and the 2023 figures. So again, we've got these additional revisions to that historical time series of data for local authorities. Excuse me, the official household projections from ONS, these used to be produced by Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, it's now ONS. These provide an estimate of the number and type of households that could form in the future, and that's linked to that SNPP, the population projection. The ONS methodology is a 2-step approach, based on population and household formation trends, and stage 2 is the bit that provides us with a detailed breakdown of household type and how that changes. So as mentioned, we've got the 2020 based household projections due out in the autumn, and these are providing a really valuable update for local authority areas. At the minute, we're currently reliant on the previous 2014 based and 2018 based rounds of projections, which you can appreciate really old and out of date now. And we're using these assumptions to assess kind of future rates of household formation. This set of charts here is just comparing the projected household figure in 2021 in Northumberland, Leeds and Hounslow. Just pick 3 local authorities where there's sort of different patterns going on compared to that census estimate in red. So you can see there's quite a degree of variation between the official household projections and what we know about households from the census. And when you drill down to a local authority level, obviously there's again quite a high degree of variation in these. So really those household projections cannot come soon enough. So obviously, whilst the household projection, whilst the ONS projections are an important input to housing needs assessments, they provide the official benchmark. We would always assess that evidence. We'll always include it, but there are limitations to solely relying on these in a housing needs assessment. Firstly, as identified, there are more up-to-date mid-year estimates, and at the end of the month, we'll have that extra 2 years worth of mid-year estimate data from the 2022 SMPP. The recent migration estimates suggest that international migration is starting to come down from that peak, which ONS acknowledges. And secondly, the population and household projections are disconnected from the standard method. We have a housing need figure for every area, but how can we evaluate what it could mean for household and population growth? How do we evaluate whether that standard method figure is sufficient to meet, for example, the needs of population where economic growth is forecast? So we really need to be able to understand the level of identified need using the standard method within the demographic and economic context of an area. So to do this, we use our in-house Vicus forecasting technology and the latest mid-year estimates, and we're generating a range of scenarios for a local authority area to provide us with the required outputs for our housing needs assessment. So Vicus is what is known as a cohort component model. It utilises the same industry standard forecasting approach as the UK statistical agencies, so ONS and Welsh Government, and also Greater London Authority, and in Scotland also the NRS. Within this type of model, this cohort component model, we're using assumptions relating to fertility and births, mortality, deaths, and then domestic, so it moves around the UK, and overseas or international migration, both inflows and outflows for both of those, to derive a population projection using trend assumptions from a historical time period. So following the same approach as ONS in what we're doing. But importantly, the population forecasting models that we have, we can combine them with these 2 additional models. We have a household headship rate model, so we can produce projections of households and dwellings or housing, and a labour force model for workforce, so labour force and employment modelling. And this kind of combined approach of these 3 models enables us to generate scenarios that will estimate the level of household growth associated with a certain population projection, and also estimate the size and structure of the labour force that could result and the level of employment that could be supported. And importantly, we can generate what we refer to as housing-led or employment-led scenarios. And in this type of scenario, we're assessing the demographic implications, so population, household growth, and other bits of the migration, births, deaths, and so on, the implications of a dwelling growth figure, housing growth figure, or a jobs growth forecast. Both of those 2 models draw their assumptions from a range of sources, such as the official household projections and census data and econometric models. So through utilising a housing-led configuration or dwelling-led configuration of the model, we can evaluate the household, population, migration and labour force implications of our standard method local housing need figure. We take those figures and we input them into our model. This is, and obviously then we can derive the labour force and employment growth outcomes from this, and that's obviously of high value when you're attempting to align future housing and jobs growth ambitions, providing that sort of connectivity between the 2, helping us to establish whether there's an uplift required to the standard method to support any kind of employment growth aspirations that a local authority might have. In a housing-led scenario, the key assumptions that we're using relate to the rates of household formation, so the size and type of households that form in the future, and who's living in the houses effectively, and then what we refer to as a dwelling vacancy rate to convert between households and dwellings. So the households are the people, and the dwellings are the properties that they live in. So we end up with that link between the two. And we're also taking account of the communal population, the population not in households, which I mentioned earlier. So it's like older people, people in care homes. So the household formation assumptions, the headship rates, this is probably, I think it's fair to say, this gets a lot of scrutiny within the work that gets done to produce evidence base for housing needs assessments for local plans. And at the minute, the assumptions that we have are drawn from those official household projections, the 2014 based and 2018 based. So we're applying those assumptions within our models to our different population growth outcomes. And obviously the aim with the standard method is to increase the housing supply, improve affordability, like increasing housing delivery. So if delivery rates were, if that was actually achieved, the rates of household formation are likely to change. We're not making the assumption that all of these houses are going to be filled by people moving to an area. There will be an element of that, but the idea is that these households will be able to form and able to move into these new properties. So in our modelling, we are routinely accounting for this through sensitivity testing. Firstly, we're adjusting the headship rates that we do have from the existing projections and rebasing them to the census. So taking account of the latest patterns of household occupancy, but also applying adjustments to improve the rates of household formation in the young adult age groups. And the exact configuration of this is really dependent on the area that we're working in, the scale of difference between trend scenarios and housing-led scenarios. So as I've mentioned, the 2022 base household projection model will be a really important update for this sort of analysis, but we will still likely need to consider the impact of variant household formation assumptions to account for potential suppressed rates of household formation. So from our scenario modelling, we can produce the outputs that are listed here. These are all crucial inputs to the housing needs assessment, and not just the housing needs assessments, the sort of housing and economic needs assessments. And then deciding which of the variant scenarios we use within the assessment of need will really depend on the area that modelling has been undertaken for. The population group we're assessing the needs for, and the scale of difference between your trend and housing-led scenarios, and if we produce them, the employment-led scenarios. So the degree of difference between the standard method housing need figure and past delivery trends have to be considered. That's something we would always evaluate within the assessment, especially where there's a high degree of difference between the two. Like I mentioned, we're not just working on the assumption that all of that will be taken up by people moving to an area. There will be that, but it's that we need to take account of how that would help the resident population form more households and fill those properties. So when we're producing these types of scenarios, we use our baseline assumptions, and then we're also sensitivity testing. Sensitivity testing particularly around the household formation, but we can also test around different rates of migration and things like reducing housing vacancy, the dwelling vacancy. So, and then in getting to the housing requirement, there'll always be consideration, as Kirsten's mentioned, of things like the supply and viability and sense checking of the evidence base with councils, with local knowledge, stakeholder engagement. So I've got an example of how this sort of evidence is getting used in our analysis, and this I've picked out the housing mix. So the housing mix model, our housing mix model, combines an identified household projection with a multivariate census table to determine the size, type, and tenure of homes that might be required in the future based on the modelled household growth and also current patterns of occupancy. And importantly, we can consider variant household projections to produce a sort of range of outcomes, and we can also consider how occupancy might change in the future. We know the census is that static point in time, and providing the right homes in the right places would likely influence how people occupy properties. So, for example, in an area with a higher proportion of older people who are under occupying large properties. We can sort of build in what potential impact could the provision of an appropriate housing for downsizing, what that might have on freeing up family homes. And obviously that analysis is also informed by things like the stakeholder engagement, current stock analysis and viability issues. So I'll hand back to Kirsten, and she's going to talk through how we use this evidence in modelling for the needs of older people.
Great, thanks, Kate. So paragraph 62 of the MPPF, this states that when establishing housing needs, the size, type and tenure of housing needed for different groups in the community should be assessed and reflected in planning policies. And this includes these groups that are listed here, amongst others. So as an example, I'm going to briefly discuss our approach to assessing the needs of older people in terms of specialist housing requirements. And that's one of the specific subgroups that the MPPF refers to. So the need for older people's housing is recognised as being critical, with evidence of this need at a national level being reinforced in various recent publications, including the Mayhew Review in 2022 and the report of the Older People's Housing Task Force in 2024. So the need to properly plan for older people's housing is supported in both the PPG, where it has its separate own section on assessing housing needs for older and disabled people, and also in the MPPF 2024. The PPG in particular reports that people are living longer lives and the proportion of older people in the population is increasing. In mid-2016, there were 1.6 million people aged 85 and over, and by mid-2041, this is projected to double to 3.2 million. PPG also recognises that these needs are diverse, stating that for plan-making purposes, strategic policy-making authorities will need to determine the needs of people who will be approaching or reaching retirement over the plan period, as well as the existing population of older people. PPG recognises 4 different types of specialist older persons housing, including the ones which are shown here. So we have age-restricted general market housing, and this is housing that's designated specifically for older people, but with no specific support or care provision on site. Retirement living or sheltered housing, and this usually consists of purpose-built flats or bungalows with limited communal facilities such as a lounge or laundry room. Again, this doesn't provide care services on site. And then we have extra care housing or housing with care, and this usually consists of purpose-built or adapted flats or bungalows with medium to high level of care available if required. And then finally, we have residential care homes or nursing homes, and these are facilities that have individual rooms within a residential building, and they provide a high level of care. The need for each of these accommodation types generally falls into one of 2 tenure categories. We have either social, which includes rented from the local authority, or other social rented or shared ownership type properties. Or on the other side, we have market housing, and that includes ownership, shared ownership and private rented accommodation. DLP's Older Persons Housing Needs Model, which I'm going to discuss briefly today, this calculates the needs for the first 3 of these tenure types. A slightly different model is used to calculate the needs for care homes and care beds. So there are a number of different models available for assessing older persons' housing needs. The model that we use at DLP, which is one that was developed by the research and analysis team, was informed by research into the choices of older persons' households, the choices that they've made regarding their future housing needs, alongside evidence of changing patterns of needs within different tenures. And we also looked at international evidence from more mature markets such as New Zealand. And this methodology builds on previous approaches, but it recalculates the prevalence rates to reflect up-to-date evidence on need and also to reflect local circumstances. I should just note here that prevalence rates, these are the number of units or bed spaces per 1,000 of the population who are aged over 75 years, and they're expressed as units per population age 75 plus. In our model, 2 adjustment ratios are calculated to reflect local circumstances. The first relates to affordability by applying a ratio based upon whether or not the median house price is higher or lower than the average for England, and this reflects the ability to afford the move into specialist housing locally. And the second relates to tenure, property size and health by applying a ratio based on whether the percentage of the household population over 75 who are homeowners of 3 or more bedrooms and are disadvantaged in terms of health or disability is higher or lower than the average for England as a whole. And this reflects an important source of need for those who are seeking to right size. A local adjustment factor is then calculated as the average between the 2 adjustment ratios, and this adjustment factor is applied to the national prevalence rates to produce a set of local prevalence rates which are specific to each authority. These local prevalence rates are then applied to the population of older people at the local plan base year, which is usually derived from the census data and projected forward to the end of the plan period. The projected number of older people aged 75 plus at the end of the plan period is then derived from the chosen demographic scenario, which underpins the housing needs assessment. So the scenarios that Kate has just mentioned. So in order to get from a housing need figure to a policy requirement, there are a number of additional steps involved. So in the case of our approach to assessing older persons' housing needs, the demographic projections are fed into our model to calculate a quantitative gross need figure, the total number of units which are expected to be required at the end of the plan period. Importantly, our assessment will also identify qualitative needs, and these will be derived from engagement with key local stakeholders, such as housing officers, registered providers, and developers. Supply of older persons housing, so this includes both existing supply and also committed future supply. So that is then netted off the total need figure to provide a net housing need figure for the plan period. This is still a policy off figure at this stage. In order to get to a policy on recommendation, additional considerations need to be taken into account. So this includes both the deliverability of the type of housing for which there is an identified need, and this again will be informed by engagement with relevant officers, providers and developers. And also linked to this, there is the consideration of viability, including whole plan viability assessment, which will determine whether or not certain policy requirements are viable and therefore deliverable. It may not therefore be feasible to meet identified housing needs in full for particular groups, such as older people or the need for affordable housing, for example, and decisions therefore need to be made on how best to maximise delivery of these housing types through policies that are effective, justified and viable. So just to run through some key conclusions from what myself and Kate have just discussed. So in plan making, it's important that authorities take account of potential future changes to the standard method. So consider potentially the application of the whole plan buffer to account for any unforeseen changes in the standard method that might arise due to the amendments to the affordability ratio and the dwelling stock figure that happen twice yearly in the run-up to plan submission. Also consider circumstances for going above the standard method and make sure that these are well evidenced and justified if that is a route that you are looking to go down. The future housing needs of other groups are derived from demographic trends, whilst the overall housing need or the standard method is not. So the potential implications of this do need to be considered. So as Kate mentioned, we can work backwards from the total number of homes to determine the population and the number of households which could potentially be supported under a dwelling-led scenario. However, a certain level of planning judgment is still going to need to be applied to determine whether this scenario is appropriate in the context of a particular authority. For example, whether it's realistic in the context of past trends, whether any adjustments to the household formation rates are needed, and whether it will provide a sufficient labour force to meet anticipated levels of jobs growth. And these are judgments that we would take and advise on through the housing needs assessment process. And once an appropriate household and population growth projections identified, then that will be used as a basis for calculating the needs for the groups. And then finally, it may not be possible to meet the housing needs of particular groups in full. So in this instance, you need to ensure that you maximise opportunities for delivery, including, for example, the allocation of sites for specific use classes, such as older persons accommodation, or introducing supportive or permissive policy wording where that's appropriate. And I think that's everything from us. So I will hand back to Matt, who will run through some questions.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, Kate. Yeah, really in-depth, interesting overview. But one question in the Q&A. Please post any more questions that you've got in there, to give you a couple of minutes to do that, just to gather your thoughts. Kate and Kirsten, could you just give us a brief overview of what does this all mean, you know, the work that you do day to day, and how do you work together? And then what are your outputs, you know, for your different clients? Should both public and private sector? Is that right? Do you want to start, Kirsten?
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Matt. So I think I'd probably say that it's very much an iterative process, the approach that we take when working with Edge. I mean, as Kate's sort of talked through, there's quite a lot of detail involved in the modelling process, and there's a lot of inputs to consider there. But then when we have a series of outputs, we'll often sort of work together to consider which of those outputs look the most realistic in the context of the authority that we're working with, whether any adjustments need to be made to those outputs to see sort of what seems the most sensible in the context. And obviously we'd engage with the local authority themselves at that stage as well, sort of have an initial findings meeting and sort of talk through the options really in terms of the different scenarios. And then, as I've discussed, there's sort of a separate process of taking those numbers then through to a policy recommendation that the local authority can sort of use to inform the local plan preparation stage as well. So it's quite an iterative process. Kate, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
No, I think iterative is a good way of describing it. The complexity of sort of the uncertainty of when data gets released. You know, in recent years, the ONS data releases haven't been as predictable as they may have been in the past. I mean, there's been lots of things that have made that challenging. So, and also the time frame that we tend to be working over. We're normally producing a sort of starting set of evidence. We then would review it. It tends to, something will change. We might get some new data, so we'll refresh things. But in terms of the sort of delivery to the clients, Edge Analytics is that sort of data provider, that insight provider on the demographics. We're providing that evidence to DLP, and we're always, our modelling and everything is very transparent. We're always providing the kind of the assumptions. You know, it has to be understood. We have to enable councils to understand this data to be able to talk to their members and the local populations, be able to stand behind this evidence. So that's we've got a good working relationship with ensuring that sort of thing is well covered.
I think that's a key point that you made there, Kate. Sorry, Matt, just in terms of the publication of data and the things that are coming out from ONS, and the fact that there is quite a lot of uncertainty there in terms of timescales for when things will or won't be published. And also, I guess, from your perspective, the quality of the data that does come out from ONS and whether that can be relied on to sort of feed into the modelling. And those are things that we would sort of discuss up front with the local authority to make people aware of that, because I think a lot of people just assume that we have the numbers sort of ready to roll and the data's there, and sometimes it's not, and you're not sort of waiting for it, but you're aware that there might be some new data at X point in time which could sort of have an impact on the outputs, basically. So it is just being aware of that at the start of the needs assessment process, basically, I think. Factoring that into programme.
We've got one question in there, and it's David who says, is there any academic research that points to areas needing to grow by more than 8% a decade in order to maintain a viable community, etc.? I know the standard method local housing needs uses a trend-based housing stock growth calculation, but is it just a trend-based calculation?
Thanks, David. I must admit, I'm not aware of any research that underpins that figure. I know that when the government came up with the 0.8%, I think at one point they were questioning whether it was going to be 0.7% of the stock. And I think because it's based on a current stock figure, so it's not actually a trend-based projection, it's just looking at what is there currently. I think their idea was, in introducing this, that it was a bit more stable and a bit more predictable than the household projections, which are only, well, at the moment we're working on projections that are sort of 10 years old, so pretty ancient really in the grand scheme of things. And I think another justification for it was the fact that it, in areas where you've got high levels of unaffordability, and you've also got where in the past you potentially had low levels of household growth projected, those areas potentially would never see any more housing because of the low levels of household projection. It would never sort of produce enough sort of housing need figure in order to sort of impact on those levels of affordability in a positive way. But I think you are right, there is an element of needing additional growth in order to sustain, sort of make viable communities and ensure that places have, you know, sufficient workforce and things in them to sort of maintain a viable community. But I'm not off the top of my head aware of any such research.
It would be possible to do a calculation like that, wouldn't it, for all sorts of different types of uses. Presumably, you know, retail floor space, you could work out, you know, how much retail floor space you need per person or per household, that sort of thing. And I suppose you could apply that in to other areas as well, you know, through an infrastructure delivery plan or something like that. You know, if you needed to.
I think one of the key things is that sort of linked to that and sort of viability of places is what Kate was mentioning about the link between housing and jobs growth. And that is always something that we do as part of this work, is ensuring that, because quite often authorities will be doing an employment needs assessment at the same time. So it's making sure that there's alignment between that evidence and the housing needs evidence to make sure that if you're, for example, you've got some massive amount of economic growth planned in the area, ensuring that the housing is there to support that growth. And I think that's where a lot of authorities tend to fall down at examination, is when they get the question, how have you linked your housing and your jobs growth, and where's the evidence to support, you know, one supporting the other. So it's just making sure that you've got that lined up, and that's something that you can do with sort of ensuring that if you are using consultants, that they talk to each other, or if it's internal officers doing the work, that they talk to each other. So yeah, I think that's important as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so you've just got one more question here in the Q&A that's just come in. But is there a mechanism for measuring actual versus projections post-delivery?
I'm guessing that's referring to housing growth projections. I mean, obviously there's the sort of the annual returns that local authorities do. I think they're doing quarterly actually, in terms of, so that will measure your delivery rate. And I suppose that's how you could link that to any projections that we had, and comparing the two. And we always do, as part of this assessment, a sort of analysis of past trend growth as well. So looking at past completions rates and seeing how those align with what is projected in the future, and whether there's sort of a massive difference between the two, or if they're fairly closely aligned in some instances. So that is, you know, part of the process as well, I think, an important part of it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Fiona.
There are no other questions. I've got one question for you. So yesterday there was a couple of headlines around house prices, so saying that house prices are flat now, maybe even falling in certain parts, and especially in London. And I noticed that the London standard method has dropped, making it since 2024 standard method down to the latest figure, Kirsten. Suppose a question is, if that continues, if house prices generally speaking sort of remain a bit flat, and maybe even incomes start to nudge above household house prices a little bit, if they actually become more affordable over time, is that going to affect the standard method going forward in simple terms?
I imagine it would certainly affect the calculation in terms of obviously the affordability adjustment that's fed in there. Although it's now done on a sort of a 5-year average, so it probably would have slightly less of an impact on it as the old standard method would have done. In terms of the affordability adjustment, I think it's also, Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, do we use the house prices to feed into the affordable housing needs assessment as well? So that would sort of immediately have some sort of an impact on that. I'd imagine if you've got the data from the VOA land registry. I'm not sure what data source it is that we use for that one off the top of my head. But I think there's probably going to be a bit of a lag as well in terms of that, because I think the reporting and the returns of house prices and sale prices, there's always a bit of a delay on those being published. So whether it would have an immediate impact on the needs assessments, I'm not entirely sure. And I guess there's also the question of whether asking prices and sale prices, the difference between those at the moment, because I know, for instance, in Sheffield, where I'm based, there's quite a difference between the price that you put it on the market for and the ultimate sale price in some instances. So how that would impact as well, I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely something worth keeping an eye on. And it'll be interesting to see if there is a downward trend in affordability. Or upwardly, more affordable, less unaffordable. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Well, I don't think we have any more questions in the Q&A. If anyone's got questions, feel free to email Kirsten or Kate individually. And get in touch if any of this, if you want to take any of this further. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Very
Bye.
much. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.